Joe Biden's first 2 years, basically, he could be a president on par with FDR and LBJ, but don't fucking laugh, because as any presidential historian should know, we can tell you that FDR and LBJ the FDR and LBJ were underestimated at first. Um, Back in the 1930s, scientific polling did not exist when Franklin Roosevelt was his first 2 years as president, but it is beyond question that his approval was enormous. Now, during Lyndon Baines Johnson's year in office, first plus year in office, his approval rating had averaged an astonishing 74.2%. But at the end of Joe Biden's second year in office, his approval rating hovers around the mid 40s. But it would seem laughable then to categorize him as being on their level. But FDR is almost always counted among the greatest American presidents, and LBJ is not. But likely, but likely, he would have been considered one of the greats had he not sunk the nation into a pointless, no-win war in Southeast Asia. And yet, a strong case can be made that Joe Biden has yet to this point, he's yet to be proven to be a great president, but he's worthy of mention alongside these two. Um, Now, as a historian who has devoted a couple of decades each to researching and writing on the eras in which the second President Roosevelt and the second President Johnson were in office, we can make the case. There was a book that was written called The Great Depression that was centered on America back from 1929 to 41, and it remains among the standard histories of that era. And the time frame of the book, the times that were changing, is what we call the long 1964, which comes from the assassination of John F. Kennedy to the fall of 1965, precisely Lyndon Johnson's first 2 years being as president. Now, each of the three men are greatly underestimated when they enter the presidency. Franklin Roosevelt, as Walter Lippmann famously wrote it in early 1932, a pleasant man who, without any important qualifications for the office, would very much like to be president. The elite intellectuals of the Kennedy administration had mocked Vice President Johnson as Rufus Cornpone and Frecklebelly, and Biden was, and in many quarters still is, and seen as too unexcitingly too old, and so on. Um, Now, both FDR and LBJ began their presidencies against a backdrop of national tragedies that provided the potential for strong support for their programs. Roosevelt took office at the height of the Great Depression, and the whole country is with him, humorous Will Rogers had said. If he burned down the Capitol, they would cheer and say, well, at least he got a fire started somehow. And Johnson, coming to power following the shock of John F. Kennedy's assassination, allowed him, as he later put it, to market his plans as the dead man's program and turn it into a martyr's cause. Um, the pandemic served as something of a parallel to what the Great Depression was for Roosevelt, and the horrors of Trumpism and the January 6th Klan insurrection could have provided a propellant similar to the assassination for Biden, but Donald Trump's cult leader control over a large fraction of the population got them to believe two huge lies: that Trump had done a good job handling the pandemic, which he didn't, and that Biden had not really won the election, which in reality Biden won the election. The more notable accomplishments during Roosevelt's first 24 months include several important pieces of depression-related legislation, such as the Emergency Banking Act, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, and the National Industrial Recovery Act, as well as the creation of numerous new federal agencies, and some of which are still with us, including the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Federal Housing Administration, and the Federal Savings and Loan Insurance Corporation, and the Tennessee Valley Authority, and others now part of history, like the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Public Works Administration, and the Civil Works Administration. Now, some of the New Deal legislation of the most lasting importance, such as the Social Security Act and the Wagner Labor Relations Act, came later in the second half of FDR's first term. In his first 2 years in office, Lyndon Johnson oversaw the massive achievements of the Civil Rights Act of the 1964 and Voting Rights Act of 1965, as well as the Economic Opportunity Act, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, the Housing and Urban Development Act, and the Immigration and Nationality Act, and it eliminated national origin, race, and ancestry as criteria for being allowed to immigrate into the United States. His administration also launched Medicare and Medicaid, the Project Head Start, and the National Endowments for the Arts and Humanities. Now Joe Biden's 2-year record stacks up well against the very high bar set by FDR and LBJ, beginning with the $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan to stimulate the economy, followed by the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act to provide for repairs and extensions to the nation's roads, bridges, railroads, water systems, the need for which is obvious, for instance, in Jackson, Mississippi, and broadband. In 2022, Joe Biden secured passage of the PACT Act, which expands on health care and benefits for those who were exposed to toxic substances during their military service, and the CHIPS and Science Act funding advanced scientific research and investing $53 billion to manufacture the silicone microchips in the U.S. The crown jewel in 2022 was the Inflation Reduction Act, which does more than any previous legislation to mitigate the climate change, and it allows Medicare to negotiate with Big Pharma to cut prescription drug prices, and it begins to crack down on tax evasion by corporations and the very rich, and much more. In December, the Respect for Marriage Act, protecting both same-sex marriage and interracial marriage, was passed as it was a reform of the Electoral Count Act, making it more difficult to overturn an election, and authorization of the Violence Against Women Act. Now, Joe Biden has also excelled on the international stage, and far more than Roosevelt did in his first 2 years, and more than Johnson ever did. Now, Biden had rallied the forces of a democracy to oppose Vladimir Putin's authoritarian aggression, and he aided Ukraine, and he revived NATO, which Trump had on the verge of collapse. Now, to grasp it all, just how much harder it is to enact a progressive program in the 2020s than it was in the mid-1960s, and consider this. Back in 1964, 77% of Americans that were polled, and astonishingly 74% of the Republicans said that they believed that the federal government could be trusted or most of the time. By 2019, only 17% of those polls trusted the federal government then. And then there is the enormous advantage that FDR and LBJ had in terms of the makeup of Congress, where both had large Democratic majorities, and we could sit around in the White House and ask each other what needs to be done, and then we can ask Dick Goodwin, who was then a special assistant to President Johnson, later had said and recall in early 1965, we should be able to pass anything we want. Biden had a small House majority and a 50-50 Senate. Now, in the Olympic competitions, the degree of difficulty of a dive, gymnastic performance, or ice skating jump is factored into the score. If we could do the same with Biden, anyone but an East German judge during a Cold War-era Olympics would award him a very high score. His first 2 years rival the accomplishments of both Franklin Roosevelt and Lyndon Johnson, but the two most effective of the 20th century presidents. And as we said about Ginger Rogers doing everything that Fred Astaire could do, Biden had to do it dancing backward and in high heels. Now, if you like the video, you can give the video a like and subscribe to my channel, RBW King. You can also hit the notification bell so that you'll be notified when a new video comes out. And if you want to support my work even further, you can donate to my Patreon link, which you can find in the About section of YouTube, or on the link below of the video. And for just a little as a few bucks a month, your donation can help go a long way. And thanks for listening.